Hi there, David here from Michelson's. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar on cybersecurity law. Just while we wait for everyone to join, I'm going to launch a quick poll asking you your role in your organization. If you wouldn't mind answering that, I'll give you 30 seconds to give your feedback there. Thanks very much. Awesome, folks. Thanks for participating in that poll. So, sharing the results today, it looks like we've mainly got compliance officers. Very warm welcome to you. Then data protection or information officers. Then third place, in-house legal. Then it looks like we have, oh, we've got a few others. Yeah, you're welcome to post in the chat, and Taylor can read those out. Then we've got folks from IT, company secretaries, and that's it. Doesn't look like any general counsel or product owners. So yeah, thanks very much for joining us today. Quite a diverse audience. Anything else? Are there any roles you'd like to read out there in the chat there, Taylor?
No, David.
Okay, cool. Awesome. So yeah, my name is David Late from Michelson's. Been here for more than 10 years, part of the furniture at this point. And very excited to be talking about cybersecurity law today. I'd like to introduce my colleagues in the call. First of all, over to Mark to introduce himself. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, David. Hello, everybody. Yeah, I'm an unusual attorney in that I've been involved in information security for probably 30 years. I studied information management in the mid-1990s, and I've qualified as an information security professional as well. And I've done a lot of work in that time, working with companies in dealing with information security. So this is, I think, very, very important. And at the moment, there are two key words that you're hearing out there relating to law: AI and cybersecurity. So cybersecurity is something that I think is very important, and I'm glad to see that we've got as many participants as we have today in this session. Thanks for joining us.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. Taylor, would you like to say hi to folks?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Taylor Pinto. I'm one of the candidate attorneys at Michelson's, and I'm not as decorated as Mark and David, but maybe one day. But I've got a big interest in cybersecurity, so I'm here to facilitate the conversation between David and Mark. If you've got any questions, I'll be keeping an eye out for that as well. So I hope you enjoy the webinar.
Great. Tomorrow's next great cybersecurity law expert is born every day, Taylor, so maybe you're the next one. So yeah, thanks for joining us. Yeah, and then just to set the scene for today, this is very much an educative session. We're trying to raise awareness about cybersecurity law and what it takes to comply with these legal rules, codes, and standards. We want to set the foundation, give a little bit of background as to the why, and then get into a bit of the how. That's really what we're trying to do today. And I don't think there's no better way to set the scene than to hand over to Mark for a discussion of the CIA triad, which isn't some sort of governmental organization spying on people through nation states. It's not that triad, it's not that CIA, but Mark's going to tell us what it's all about.
Thank you, David. So when we deal with cybersecurity, obviously one of the questions we've got to ask is why? Well, David's going to deal with this in more detail, but information has become valuable. And because it's become valuable, the funny thing about criminals is they go where things are of value, not like us lawyers who just do it for the love of the law. So increasingly, we're seeing the law provide for appropriate safeguards. And insofar as why we should be doing it as well, is we're seeing that we don't only have our own information, we have third-party information that we're custodians of. So we have an obligation to them, an obligation of care to them. But and if we don't comply with those obligations, both from the point of view of regulatory issues, but as well as those contractual issues, and it's just not good business. We're going to go out of business if we don't deal with this. So there are very compelling reasons why companies should invest in cybersecurity and do it properly. There are lots of companies that pay lip service to it, tick a few boxes, and they think that they've got cybersecurity. It doesn't work that way. The next thing is that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Cybersecurity is principle and outcomes based. We've got to look at what we need to do and decide how we're going to be able to do that. So there are lots of questions about, are we a small company and should we be doing this? A lot of the guidance that there is will apply to you, but in a different way to a large corporate, etc. So we've got to actually understand those things. And one of the ways of starting to understand that is to understand the foundation for information security, which is the CIA triad, as David has mentioned. So the C stands for confidentiality. And what are we trying to do there? Well, only the persons who need to know information should actually have access to it, okay? So we're protecting that information from third parties seeing that information and probably shouldn't see it. And that's become very important, of course, in data protection and privacy generally. We do that by way of access controls. Typically, we, as I've suggested already, we want to make sure only those people have access. So we have to put in access controls, and to achieve that, we need to ensure that we know who we're dealing with, that we can authenticate who we're dealing with, and we know what the authority is to see information. So there are two elements to it: the authenticity and also the authority that we have to look at. And typically we base that on a least privilege or need to know basis. Just by way of an example, we all understand finance quite well, and we understand that not too many people in an organization have access to the accounts of the organization. So we authenticate those people that should have access, and we know that they have the authority to do so. And the authorities might vary. Might be that some of them can change the information, some of them can only read the information. So that's part of the way that we deal with confidentiality. We can also use encryption mechanisms to screen information or to make sure that it cannot be read by malicious attackers, etc. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but encryption has become very important in how we protect information. And then, very often I'm asked, but isn't confidentiality the same as privacy? It's not. They're different. They're very similar in many ways, but they are different. And confidentiality, typically we're talking about all information, whatever the nature of the information, and privacy, we're talking about personal information. Okay, what about integrity, the I in the top triad? Is the information true? Is it accurate? Is it of good quality? These are things that are very, very important as we are reliant on it. And this will become even more so in the AI context, where in training models, we're going to be providing those models with information from particular data sets. If that information lacks integrity, or it can be attacked, or there can be injections, prompt injections, etc., that can vary that information, we're going to get the wrong answers. And the whole thing there is integrity, garbage in, garbage out. That principle has been around computing for some time. So with integrity, what we're really trying to do is to be able to prevent changes to the data. And if changes occur, that we are able to detect them. Those are the important elements of looking at integrity. Then availability, okay, and that's obviously the A in the triad. But what we are doing there is to try and make sure that those that are authorized to see the information always have it available when they need it, okay. So it obviously relates to confidentiality, but it's almost the opposite. Providing availability to people so that when they require it, that the information, that it's available to them. Now, probably what is most prevalent in that area from the point of view of cybersecurity is the incidence of ransomware attacks, where essentially that information is taken away or it's locked so that people cannot see it. And that, of course, creates a problem in your business. You can't carry on with your business if you don't have the information to do so. So availability is also very important. Now, I want to just go back and look at how priorities have changed in cybersecurity over the years. So initially, availability was the big issue. Okay, there were less cyber criminals around. Privacy law was not as pronounced as it is today, etc. So the IT guys got into trouble when systems were not available. And there was quite a strong bias towards convenience as opposed to security in a lot of instances in making sure that the availability was there. As cyber criminals and others started attacking systems, we started seeing a change in that attitude around availability, and particularly with data protection laws like POPI and GDPR, etc. There was more of an emphasis on the confidentiality of making sure that that information that we had custody of was not being seen by unintended persons. What we are now seeing is that there is an increased, I'm not saying that the emphasis on availability and confidentiality has gone away, but what we are seeing is a greater emphasis on integrity than we've ever seen before. And again, the reason is largely AI and the fact that we are using information so widely in so many different things that we do, that if we've got bad information and we can't trust it, well, then we don't, we can't really trust our businesses. We can't trust information that we might provide to clients and things like that. So integrity has increased in emphasis, if I can put it that way, over the last while. Two other points that I think are important in looking at the general cybersecurity scenario is that we're also seeing resilience being emphasized. And the reason is simply that it's not a question these days of if you're going to be hacked. It's a question of when you're going to be hacked, or not necessarily hacked, that you're going to have a compromise of some kind that creates difficulty for you. So the ability to be able to identify that there is a compromise and react quickly to that compromise is very important. So part of what we'll see, and I'm not too sure that everybody is familiar with the joint standards that have been published by the Financial Sector Conduct Authority and the Prudential Authority, but those relate to the financial sector. And one of the things about the financial sector is the question of systemic risk. Okay, so there's always the possibility, if there are not good controls, and there are typically the SARB has done a pretty good job, the Prudential Authority has done a pretty good job of making sure that banks and other institutions, financial institutions, do the right things. But one can imagine that, let's assume for a moment that you are a financial institution and you have a third party that you are entrusting with information, and that third party is compromised. That might have an effect on your being able to actually carry on to do certain business. And we know that at times we have these outages and the inconvenience that is caused when financial institutions are unable to use their systems properly. But that could then have an even greater effect. And that could be that a bank simply can't do business with other banks for a while. And that creates quite a lot of chaos. So what we're seeing is resilience is important. And another thing that we've seen, and it is in the joint standards as well, is that there's an additional issue which is now being emphasized, and that's authenticity. Okay. Now we're in an interconnected world. We communicate with one another electronically in a myriad of ways, but systems also communicate with one another. Very often without necessarily, I'm not saying there isn't human oversight ultimately, but they would do that automatically in a lot of cases. So one of the fears that has arisen with AI is the ability to actually masquerade as a system or a person. So the whole issue of deep fakes, for instance, with persons, becomes important. And also, one of the issues is just simply that systems, if we don't know that we're dealing with the right system, we might be dealing with a system that has been interposed by criminals. And the authenticity then of that system, knowing that that is the correct system, has become very important as well. So I think that if you understand the CIA triad, that is a very good first step in understanding what we've got to do around information security. And you know, on your journey, if you don't understand it, you're going to have a lot of difficulty. So please pay a bit of attention to how that works and how we might help you in that regard. Thank you. Thanks, David.
Mark, thanks for setting the foundation here with the CIA triad. And your last point on authenticity actually leads us quite neatly into this foundational discussion of data having value. And, Mark's alluded to this in a few different points where, criminals go after things that are worth something, right? Bad actors go after things that they can resell or somehow exploit in the secondary market. And that's really what your information, your data has become. And everyone throws around this phrase, information is the oil of the 21st century. It gets attributed to Peter Sondergaard. We've lost Mark there, but I'm sure he'll be back shortly. And really the nature of that is that in the same way that we've really arguably had a crisis of fossil fuels and oils in the 21st century, right? People haven't looked after them properly. We've had oil spills, we've had climate change, we've had all sorts of horrible things happening with that. I think we're seeing the same thing potentially happening with data. And, going back to Mark's alarm bells there around AI, I always say that if information is the oil of the 21st century, then AI is the new refinery, right? It's going to take that data and do all sorts of things with it that maybe we hadn't anticipated before. So it's going to magnify kind of whatever issues and problems we have there. And drawing this analogy, some people call oils like the black gold, right, of the earth, well, data is the gold of our businesses. It's worth something. And in the same way that you keep gold in a vault, you protect it, you need to protect your gold as a business. And I want to illustrate that by drawing attention to some recent case studies that quite neatly also show the increasing dangers of AI, and these really relate to the social engineering side. There's really quite an interesting one coming out of Italy recently, and I mean, it's a number of incidents. But essentially, scammers in Italy use the voice. Please, everyone, excuse my Italian pronunciation. I studied French, not Italian, but any Italians in the audience, please forgive me. But their defense minister, Guido Corsetto, folks got a hold of clips of his voice, and some say you only need a few seconds of someone's voice to clone it authentically. And they use this to make artificial AI-based phone calls to various high-profile people, including Giorgio Armani, and then critically a guy called Massimo Moratti. So he's a kind of a famous Italian petroleum magnate, billionaire, that sort of thing, and various other famous people. And yeah, he also owned the Milan Football Club, was his claim to fame. And they falsely claimed that Italian journalists were kidnapped and urgently needed a ransom and money in order to make the payments. So that's a common thing. They create false urgency on the phone call. And Massimo Moratti transferred almost €1 million to a fraudulent Hong Kong account. He thought it was something that the Bank of Italy would reimburse him for. I don't know why he thought that. Yeah, it was an interesting case where the Italian cops got involved in doing that. So that's quite a high profile one. And then maybe a more poignant one, but not as high profile in terms of celebrities. In California, it's an older man named Anthony got an alarming call. So an AI generated audio scammers perfectly replicated his son's voice, claiming involvement in a serious car accident. I think what was even more nefarious here was it wasn't just one call, it was that call. Then it was other calls following up purporting to be from lawyers saying there was a pregnant woman involved in the car crash. Initially, she was injured. Then they phoned back and said she died and bail had gone up to another amount, and really pressure, pressure, pressure. Again, kind of really exploiting the fact that maybe he's an older person, doesn't necessarily understand, exactly what's happening with these things and stuff like that. So even though he was initially skeptical, the pressure was on, and eventually it literally happened that he was told to deliver the money via a ride-hailing service like an Uber or a Lyft or something like that. Came and picked up the money, And it was only after intervention from his daughter that he worked out he'd been victim of a sophisticated AI scam. So we think we can trust people's voices on the phone. Increasingly, we can't. And so even that little piece of information of your voice, right, which you don't think anything of talking to anyone or putting it on a video clip on social media, someone gets hold of that little nugget of your voice, and they can use that piece of information to essentially do a social engineering attack where they convince you that they're your loved one or someone you know or something like that, and can perpetrate things against you. So, Mark, any kind of thoughts on these voice cloning scams and how they tie into the broader cybersecurity discussion?
Yeah, I think that is important because we have, just by nature, we've trusted people's voices as a method of authentication. And it is amazing. I mean, you think of all of the people that you know and how you can distinguish their voices. It's amazing how our human brain deals with that. So it's almost we are unsuspecting victims in a lot of cases when that type of thing happens. And very often I've seen a number of cyber security scams, and people say, oh, I was stupid to fall for it. And let me tell you, in a lot of instances, they're incredibly intelligent people. It's just simply that their nature is that they do trust. And one of the things we're seeing in cybersecurity is a push to zero trust, which is another issue entirely outside the scope of what we're dealing with today. But that is, the point is that we've got to make sure that we check first before we trust.
Yeah. And just on that, trying to avoid these things, and we often look at these people and think, oh, they're things they could have done differently. Well, if you look at some of the advice to avoid these sorts of scams, I mean, things like verifying caller identities. I mean, sure, you can do that, but particularly in a country like South Africa, how many unsolicited calls do you get every day, right? Can you sit there identifying every single one? Limit voice exposure online. I think that one's hilarious. Here we are recording an hour-long webinar that'll be kept in the Michelson's archives for perpetuity with many, many hours of our voices. Anyone wants to clone that, well, they've got the treasure trove right here. So anyone who's interacting in any meaningful way online, good luck limiting your voice exposure online. Quite a clever one of coming up with a family or company safe word. I think that one's maybe potentially quite useful. And then, classic stuff like reporting, suspicious activity immediately. So, these are all quite old school solutions to what is quite a new school problem. And I think it's also just important to bear in mind common sense solutions to these sorts of things. But yeah, with that background of information's worth something, people will do and go to all sorts of lengths and involve all sorts of new technologies to get their hands on it. I think one of the tendencies we see in business is folks tend to rush to policies, right? They think, oh, we've got a problem here. We've got an audit coming up, or we want to stay JSE listed and meet all those listing requirements. Let's get a piece of paper in place. And Mark, I know you have some feelings on folks rushing too readily into policies. So I'd hand over to you to discuss that.
Yeah, indeed, David, I have strong feelings, and that's very often people have approached me and said, please, will you write our policies? And I say, I can't. And they look at me and they say, but you're expert in this. And I say, yes, I can't write your policies. I can assist you in writing your policies, but we've got to do a bit of homework beforehand. And I think that if you understand this, you'll see the reasoning why policies are not something that you do first. It's something that is a product of quite a few other things that need to happen. So the first thing is, and it's quite interesting, I was in the poll, I didn't see any C-suite people in the session today. But cybersecurity is undoubtedly a governing body responsibility. So many of you are here are going to be in the position of, yeah, well, we've been told to be here, or it's part of our job from the point of view, we see it as part of the delegated responsibility that we have. Now, there's nothing wrong with the governing body delegating the responsibility of cybersecurity as long as they maintain oversight. And if you look at the King 5, which has been published recently for comment, that is something that is stressed. But we also see it in the joint standards, where again, insofar as financial institutions are concerned, and financial institutions, in terms of that standard, there are lots of them. They can be very small entities that still will fall within the definition of a financial institution. And the joint standards very definitely say the ultimate responsibility lies with the governing body. And even in Papaya, the default information officer is the head of the organization, the CEO, typically. Okay, they can delegate that, but they're not entitled to abdicate that. And it is important that we understand, and governing bodies understand their responsibility, because ultimately they are also responsible for the purse strings and the investment that has to be made. Now, what should they do? Well, the first thing is, if they don't have the expertise themselves, they should seek expertise to assist them, but they should also appoint a team within the organization to investigate cybersecurity. Now, this is multidisciplinary, okay? There, again, according to the poll, there may be more. I'm not sure that everybody participated in the poll, but there was one IT person today. They are very, very important. They're not necessarily the people that might lead the cybersecurity, but they are the people that tell us what controls there are technologically, or how we might change things technologically to ensure that we protect information properly. But there are others, your information security people, if you have them, business, of course, HR plays a role. So this is a multidisciplinary task. And the other thing is just remember that when we look at information, typically different parties own or are responsible for that information. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So we need to put together that team to be able to say, what are we going to do? So what have they got to do? What has that team got to do? The first thing they've got to do is identify the information and what the scope is of what they are trying to do. It might be geographical, it might be the systems that are being used, etc., and of course the information itself. But we can't govern what we don't understand. We can't manage what we don't understand. So unless we know what information we're dealing with, it's very difficult to govern that. And one of the things that one of the questions that was asked prior to the session was, what about unstructured information? Well, you know, these days there are discovery tools like Microsoft Purview that assist us in being able to discover what information we've got, where it is, and even the unstructured information becomes more structured, okay? And we're able to deal with that more readily and understand what the principles are that we have to apply. We also then have to identify who is responsible for that information, because they're the people that will tell us who should have access to that information and what the security is around that information, what the value is to that information. Typically, the greater the value, the more secure you have to actually make your measures in that regard. So, you know, again, let's use finance as an example. Don't ask the IT guys to tell you what's important in finance. They can't. And I know that this has happened often. I've seen it, I've experienced it, where cybersecurity is simply abdicated to the IT guys. And they can't start because they don't really understand the information. That's not their domain. Okay, their domain is the plumbing, getting the information to the right places and making sure that it's not tainted. The water that flows in that in the plumbing, and that information is the responsibility of the owners of that information. And they must say where tap should be so that people can actually get to the water and where they can switch it off. Okay, so just using that as an analogy, you can see that there's this interaction. We need to work together to be able to deal with this. Once you've done that, and you understand what your information is and what your systems are and what you might be able to do, you can then do a risk analysis. And information is, cybersecurity is risk-based. We don't just secure everything, just in the same way as we don't do that in the physical world. We secure things in accordance with what we think is necessary to prevent that risk, okay? So, you know, you think of your own home, there aren't necessarily laws that tell you that you've got to have a barbed wire fence or electric prevention on your fences, treadie doors and things like that. Those are things we do because we understand the risk. So unless you understand that information and start analyzing that risk, you're not going to get to that point. Okay. Once you've done that, you can then start classifying your information and saying, okay, this information is very valuable. It's top secret. This is how we've got to protect it. We've got to be very limited access to this. You're probably going to find, if you do a good information schema around this, that is actually fairly limited. The really high level security that you need would be fairly limited. Then you're going to get the next level of information, which is confidential to the organization typically. And for instance, personal information will fall into that to a large degree, how you deal with it. But you've got to classify that information. You've got to know that that is personal information and that's what you've got to do with it. You're not going to encrypt everything. You're not going to have very, very stringent controls on absolutely everything within your organization, because then the balance between security and convenience and availability of the information is thrown out. It is at that point that you can start saying, okay, let's start writing policies and the procedures and standards that support those policies. Now, we're not going to do it today, but certainly the writing of policies leaves much, much to be desired in my experience in the South African context. Policies are documents that are simply written so that you can say to the auditors, we've got a policy. That doesn't help your information security, because they should be in the lifeblood of the organization. And if you have policies that are simply there for the auditors and not for everybody else, well, that doesn't work. Okay, so you want to look at that more carefully and look at how you deal with policies. So if you don't have this approach, one of the things that we see emphasized in standards and in laws as well is that we must have security by design. Okay, in the EU AI Act, it is one of those things that is emphasized, that security must be by design. You don't bolt it on afterwards. You start at the very beginning by getting all of this information and then working out what the security measures should be and designing them, particularly where you have novel projects, or those of you who are embarking on looking at AI. I would suggest that the approach of AI by design and security by design is a very, very important way of doing this to ensure the security. So another element of an important element of policies, etc., is that they're the laws of the organization. And that's at a policy level. The procedures are more the regulations of how we do things procedurally. And the standards might be, for instance, a standard might be that you have a standard agreement. You always use that agreement in a particular instance. But you need to train people to use them correctly. And if your policies are poor and your procedures and standards are poor, your training will probably be poor. And you can't expect people to read through volumes of information like this. You need to ensure that your policies, etc., are broken down so that those people that need to read them, and that you have a suite of policies rather than trying to put everything into one policy or the procedures, etc. They should be audience-based. And, you know, if you do that, if we are able to train the people properly in cybersecurity, you are able to change them from being one of the weaknesses that we have. The human weakness is recognized as one of the greatest weaknesses we have in cybersecurity, to one of your best defenses against cybersecurity attacks. But it means that you should be going through this process. And it sounds complex, but it's not really that complex, because we've got lots of guidance in how to be able to do these things. There are literally volumes and volumes and volumes that are written about different aspects of cybersecurity that we can rely on. Thank you, David.
Thanks very much, Mark, for setting the scene there and giving us your very well thought out reasons for why we shouldn't jump too readily into policies. And I just want to riff off the one point you raised of cybersecurity being risk-based and really explain how that plays out in data protection laws. So a lot of people, hear, gosh, it sounds like a lot of work to do things properly, right? And, do our risk analysis and work out where our data is. Surely there's a checklist in the laws somewhere, right? 20, 200 things I can just do and then say I comply with the cybersecurity requirements and relevant laws. And unfortunately for all of us, and maybe fortunately for the world, it's not as simple as that, right? So if you look at any data protection law in the world, and I'm really talking about, kind of the Rolls-Royce GDPR that kind of sets the standard in Europe, and then more regional data protection laws like POPIA in South Africa, you'll see something along the lines of a clause saying that you need to implement appropriate and reasonable TOMs. Now, this is an acronym, it's a term of art. It stands for technical and organizational measures. And, in typical legal drafting fashion, it's not very clear exactly what those are. So let's break it down for you. So there's two parts to TOMS. There's technical and there's organizational. And I always like to say technical is the stuff you can buy. You throw enough money at it, you will get the technical stuff, right? It's broken down into digital controls or digital safeguards and physical safeguards. So physical safeguards in a country like South Africa, that's stuff we really understand intimately. That's having CCTV cameras, that's having security guards, that's having access control cards, some of the measures. And Mark mentioned a lot of these categories kind of at the beginning, or these kinds of measures. I just want to contextualize them in terms of these different classifications and kind of ways of thinking about them. Digital, this is the stuff that your IT team typically takes care of, right? These are your blinky boxes. This is the router that's kept up to date with the latest firmware and updates. This is your endpoint protection software. This is your intrusion detection system, all that sort of stuff. And usually most organizations are pretty strong in the technical stuff, right? It's very clear, very measurable. But that's only half of the TOMS equation. The other side is the organizational side. So that's broken down into operational and administrative. Now, operational, that's what I always like to say. That's what the powerless majority in your organization do. Going back to Mark's point of training your staff, that's what your rank and file do. That's making sure the people who are, in your call center or your client success managers, whoever's the bulk of your organization, it's making sure they make the right decisions when it comes to not clicking on the phishing links. Make sure that they don't fall for the AI phone scam and divulge sensitive information that could grant people access to your systems. That's your operational security. Administrative, that's what your powerful minority do. That's where your leadership comes in. That's where your board gives you buy-in, gives you the necessary resources to finance your cybersecurity compliance project. That's where you go and get your cyber liability insurance. That's where you eventually, after doing your homework and getting things in the right sequencing, get your cybersecurity policies and incident response policies and other things like that. So those four aspects working together, and this way of thinking about it's breaking the two sides of TOMS into two further categories. This thinking comes from ICO in the UK, the Information Commissioner's Office, and their guidance on cybersecurity law compliance. Now, within that, people say, okay, well, all you've given me are these four broad categories. Is there anything more specific? Some laws, so for example, the GDPR then goes on to mention a few technologies by name, but in a very broad way. It mentions encryption, mentions pseudonymization. These are really broad categories of tools. You could be talking encryption in transit using various internet protocols. You could be talking encryption at rest. It's not saying do any of these things. And pseudonymization, that's essentially a way of minimizing data use and using a piece of the data to refer to the whole or something like that. Again, not that useful, right? So critically, what these laws are doing is they're putting the ball in your court, making you do the homework to work out what is reasonable and appropriate, essentially what is commensurate to your organization based on the risks you face, which comes from the volume of information you're processing, the sensitivity of the information you're processing, the risks to the data subjects involved, and then also your resources, right? What's expected of a JSE listed company is not what's expected of a mom and pop organization in a garage somewhere, but what's expected of a mom and pop organization that processes highly sensitive health data is far more than maybe a large corporate that doesn't process sensitive data. So you've got to think of all these factors and things, and it really comes down to you to come up with a compelling story as to why you decided what measures and what security safeguards to implement. But those four categories are a useful way of thinking about it. And yeah, typically the organizational side is where you're weak, and often on the organizational side, it's the operational side. It's the powerless majority that can pose a threat to your organization, but usually because you maybe haven't invested enough time in training and listening and creating a culture of security in your organization. But let's put a little bit more meat on this framework. And well, using framework in another sense, Mark's actually going to discuss various cybersecurity frameworks and how those might impact and be useful for us in better describing the requirements of relevant cybersecurity laws. So over to you there, Mark.
Okay, so when we look at the laws, and it's often been said to me, but there's so little law relating to information security. And that is true in many respects. And certainly in South Africa, we've been remiss around cybersecurity in a lot of instances. So let's just start with the worst law around on information security, and that's the minimum information security standard, which is supposed to apply to all of our government institutions. Now, firstly, this was drafted in 1996. It was deficient then. It was a miss then. Now it is just terrible because, unfortunately, technology has gone a long way in the last 30 years, and obviously, from that perspective, it hasn't been dealt with. So, at the highest level, our government has not really looked at this properly. But if we look at a couple of other things, the lawyers, and then many of them in this session, should be familiar with the ECT Act and Chapter 3 of the ECT Act. Now, if you're familiar with that act, you'll know that things like the original document and many of the issues around evidence, etc., rely, and the word integrity is replete in that section. So we have to actually understand how we deal with integrity. We can't really understand Chapter 3 of the ECT Act properly unless we understand cybersecurity and what we've got to do to ensure integrity. Then, of course, we've got PAPIA. Now, PAPIA is the first act which dealt with information security at all, that expressly said you need to put into place technological and organizational measures to safeguard personal information. I actually drafted those sections, and I did a lot of research before that. I was part of the South African Law Reform Commission. I did a lot of research before that with information security specialists. And the fact of the matter is that it is impossible to deal with rules around information and how we need to secure information. We have to look at what outcomes we are trying to achieve and then provide people with guidance in how they reach those outcomes. The reason is simply that information is ubiquitous. We all use it differently. We use different technologies. We use different information. We use different terminology in dealing with it. So dealing with information and trying to put it in a rules-based mechanism is useless. So what does PAPIA say? It says you've got to put those in place, but you've got to have regard to generally accepted information security practices and principles. And that is when we start looking at the volumes of information that there are around security. So again, to extend my argument around there being lots of law, one of the principles of our common law is that we should act as the reasonable man where there is no law, okay? Or let's say the reasonable person. And that's been part of our law for a long time. And how do we determine whether we're acting reasonably in these instances? Well, we can measure ourselves against these standards that have been developed, the international standards. There are lots of them, to see whether we've actually dealt with this correctly. Insofar as laws are concerned, the joint standards which were published by the Financial Sector Conduct Authority and by the Prudential Authority are examples of laws that I think we will see far more of in the future. We will certainly see, I think, a lot more law around health information. We'll see a lot more law evolving around how we deal with information in AI, etc., as well. But the law typically lags behind. So the way to look at it is to say, to be proactive and say, okay, we know what the general principles are. We can actually apply those principles. And we can see where they apply in our organizations. So just like the joint standards in Europe, there's something called DORA, the Digital Operations Resilience Act. And that sets out cybersecurity and the issues of governance and resilience, as the name says, because as I've expressed earlier, particularly within financial sector, if there is a breach, how do you recover as quickly as you can? And we see within different sectors, sectoral laws, like the payment card industry has something called the payment card industry data security standard. So if you're in different industries, there will be some laws, or maybe there aren't, but there are certainly going to be standards that will help you. So what are the primary standards that we should look at? Now, if we look at this, we can see that these standards have evolved from what was the first published standard, was the British Standard 7799, that was published in 1997. Now, myself and Professor Basi van Solms of UJ University, was the head of computer science there. We did a lot of work around this at that time. And that security control, or those standards, have morphed into what is now ISO 27001. There have been lots of iterations in the meantime. That was published, the latest version is 2022. And what that does, that ISO 27001 is an international standard which helps you in implementing, maintaining, and continually improving your cybersecurity, establishing an information security management system. And what I described to you earlier on about identifying information, classifying it, the risk, and making sure that you apply risk analysis to it, etc., those typically are dealt with in the ISO 27001 standard. But what it importantly does is, it said, and sorry, if I could just pause there for a second, because I'm often asked this question, you can be certified against the standard, but you don't have to be. You can align yourself with that standard and make sure that you apply those things that are important from that standard to assist you. Now, what are those things? They are contained in a document called ISO 27002, also published in 2022, that sets out the controls that are necessary. And part of what that does, there are 93 controls. And essentially what ISO 27001 says, take a look at 27002, map all of those controls and determine which apply and which do not apply. So it's a question of actually applying or explaining why they don't apply to you. That's not unfamiliar to us. We've seen it in the King reports over the years around corporate governance. So those same principles apply. And those will essentially give you detailed best practices of what is expected globally in addressing cybersecurity. There are other standards. There are lots of other standards. One of the standards that is often mentioned is the NIST standard, which is the National Institute for Standards and Technology in the USA. And they provide standards that apply to all of their federal agencies, that they must use those standards, but also provide a guideline that provide these type of controls that you can put into place. And there are 5 core functions there. And again, the first function is to identify the information. Then the next function is to protect it, okay? And determine how you protect it. The next function is to detect where those protections are failing. The next functions are to respond and recover. So the resilience element that we see in other legislation starts coming into those as well. So, as I say, there are many standards that can be applied. And it's not that difficult to actually make those inquiries and find out which standards would apply to your organization best. There are standards that have specifically been designed to address smaller organizations, etc. That's the CIS, and I forget it, but it's something information security that standard. I forget the full name, but we'll put it up on our website at some stage for you to take a look at as well. That is very often helpful as well. So my view is that there's a lot of guidance around this. It is not as complex as it seems if you put the right teams together, that you have people that can talk to the technology side and people that can talk to the organizational side and people that can talk to the law and say, these are the things that we've got to do to protect ourselves against what? The first thing is compliance liability. The second thing is simply protecting information that we are custodians of and that we have a duty to protect. Personal information is not the only information that we will have, that we'll be custodians of. And the third thing is to be able to do business, because in the future, many organizations are going to, let's say, and the joint standards require this, that if you're a service provider to a financial institution, that financial institution must agree with you what information security you put in place. So the same cascade effect that we see, or that we are seeing with PUPI, where the larger organizations are saying, if we're doing business with you, you've got to give us certain assurances around how you protect personal information. The same thing is going to apply with cybersecurity generally. So as I said earlier, my belief is that cybersecurity is a good investment if you do it properly. If you do it haphazardly, I'm afraid you're just wasting your time completely. But if you do it properly, it is a very, very important investment. And it is simply, in my view, just good business in the 21st century. Thank you, David.
Thanks very much, Mark. And yeah, just to go on to your point and the challenges of, handling cybersecurity properly, I think the curveball that's been thrown to us all amidst the potential opportunities, really the rise of AI. I mean, AI is nothing new. You kind of raised at the start of the session, but I'm reminded of the phrase, "A rising tide raises all boats," right? In the same way that AI is going to make your organization more efficient, going to enable you to do things more quickly and efficiently and more effectively than you ever could before. It's going to help the cyber criminals and other bad actors in the same way, right? We already saw that with the example of the phone voice-based scams. So, everything from deep fakes to more convincing phishing emails. We're even talking about adaptive malware. So, theoretically, I haven't seen any case studies of it, but, Trojans and various other forms of viruses that can rewrite themselves using AI technology and things like that. Then the manipulation and poisoning of AI models, that's also something we have to worry about. So yeah, we're going to see some new threats coming out there. And we don't have all the answers to that. We're just raising that. You got any thoughts on that, Mark, just for a second or two? Anything you've seen in the AI space around cybersecurity that's particularly worrying?
David, you're quite right. The attack surface is much broader. I think that the encouraging thing is that we can use AI to help us in our cybersecurity efforts as well. And the good AI people are already, the good cybersecurity people are already doing that in a lot of ways. But we also just have to be cognizant of the fact that there will be new threats. And one of the things about the criminals as well is that they always try to get one jump ahead of the law and the protections that you put into place. So this is not something that is an event. It is something that is an ongoing effort to ensure that you are protected properly. And I don't think that's any different from other risks that we typically deal with on a daily basis. Thank you, David.
Great point there. Thanks, Mark. It was definitely a journey, not a destination. We've got about 5 minutes left. I'm actually just going to hand over to Taylor for some burning questions that have kind of come out of our conversation today, being posed to us, or maybe some have been posed to us beforehand. Taylor, what are some of the really cool, juicy questions around cybersecurity law that have jumped out for you?
The ones that have come out to me that are juicy are the ones that are asking the practical questions. Mark's alluded to them before, but I think it's worth unpacking. But it's how do you help small businesses with cost-effective solutions to manage their data and cybersecurity risks?
You want to handle that one, Mark? So really, what do you
Sorry,
do? Well,
I didn't hear what Taylor said. Can you
good.
just repeat that,
Good. So
Taylor?
the
Sorry.
question is, what measures can small businesses, so SMEs, take to comply with cybersecurity laws? And I think the challenges here are around budget, time, effort, getting bang for your buck. What do they turn to in your
Yeah.
experience?
So look, that is an important question and sometimes a difficult question because we know that there are constraints on budget and time and etc. in dealing with smaller entities. But the point is that it is almost a question of it's one of the costs of doing business. But please also bear in mind, and one of the things that the joint standard stresses, DORA does it as well. DORA refers to a principle of proportionality. The joint standards build on that, and they talk about the size of the business, what they were processing, etc. And even in the GDPR, in looking at risk, cost is a factor. Okay, so you're not going to spend R1 million to secure something when you go out of business to be able to do that. But typically, you should be looking at what the principles are and how to apply them. And we are all using technology these days that very often the protections are built into the technologies that we are using. Okay, so it's not just the technology that you get. Typically, we get the technology on a basis that it's configured for convenience rather than security. What we've got to look at in those technologies is to say, okay, if there's this risk, is that configuration for convenience the right balance between where we need to get it to a security level? So those are the type of things that small businesses should be doing. And one of the things as well is just educating people. One of the things that the joint standard requires as well is that governing bodies are educated in cybersecurity. And that's a very important thing because they're the ones that have got to make the decisions around the opportunities and the risks. That's where it lies. Directors, that's their job to say, these are the opportunities, we can exploit them and make money. These are the risks. If we don't guard against these risks, we might not make so much money, or we might go out of business. Those are the type of things that have to be looked at by any entity, regardless of their size.
Great point. Thanks, Mark. We're getting quite a few questions in the chat around general privacy law compliance. Unfortunately, those aren't really part of the scope today. So just have a look at our website. We've got lots of stuff there. And those of you who've asked those questions, we'll try and pick them up afterwards and send you some specific guidance on that. Taylor, just coming back to the cybersecurity questions, what other things are jumping out for you there?
The one is how do you ensure that your service providers comply with your cybersecurity measures?
Yeah, so third-party contractors, people who are providing you with goods and services. Got any thoughts on that one, Mark? I do if you don't.
Well, David, you do that. You do that for one of our, well, independently for a major client of ours. So I think you should answer that one.
Yeah, so I'll talk about that measure. So I mean, some companies, have really stringent compliance programs, right, for their suppliers, where if you even want to do business or get paid by them, they make you jump through hoops. And the most extreme of those out there actually require independent auditors with various certifications to go through those list of checks and balances on their behalf, check the documents and verify that you're actually doing that. Look, that is pretty exceptional. Most companies don't have the kind of global clout and the power to kind of enforce that sort of thing. Of look, you want to dance with me, you gotta have the safety stuff in place, right? Most go to the point of in a contract, often in a data processing agreement with a security annexure, really setting out the minimum security requirements that are required to do business with them, and you essentially warrant that you've done those things and indemnify them to the extent that you haven't. So then there would be some contractual recourse if you aren't. They don't actually come into your house and check things, but some of the big ones do, and they use third parties to do that. Um, Yeah, your most basic things are really assurances and contracts that you're doing what's required in terms of relevant data protection and other laws to prevent unauthorized access to, to essentially comply with the cybersecurity requirements in that. Any other thoughts on that one, Mark?
One of the things about that it is important is that, and I've seen it in the data protection space. People say, okay, well, here's our agreement. If you want to do business with us, this is what you've got to do. And they have an annexure, which is a one-size-fits-all thing, which is very often quite strict. And what you should be doing is saying, no, it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. Have the agreement. The agreement doesn't have to change. It can apply equally across lots of different organizations, but the annexure is dependent on the type of information that's being processed, its sensitivity, the period over which it's being processed, all of those things which lead to the risk that has to be managed. You need to actually address those in those annexures to say that is the appropriate information security there. One of my clients, we actually have 5 different annexures to their data processing agreement that they choose from depending on the type of third party that they're dealing with. You know, if you're dealing with somebody who's got the keys to your kingdom and is controlling your IT and things like that, well, you better have a damn good agreement with them. If you've got a service provider that you're sending information to so that they can endorse gifts for you to your 100 favorite clients, it's a completely different thing. So you need to look at those things quite carefully. Thanks, David.
That's a great point. Thanks, Mark. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Folks, thank you so much for your time and attention today. Mark, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and guidance on this matter. Taylor, thanks for being our trusted co-pilot today. Folks, we look forward to chatting to you again very soon. From Mark, Taylor, and myself, all the best. Cheerio.